Welcome to our second session for this. I think it doesn't need any introduction, so let's just get started. Over here we can see the question about these kind of like bouncy, glossy effect against other objects. And I can already tell you this is a pain to do on regular machines. Anything that has to do with simulations that need a little bit more detail, because it just takes time. To be honest, I'm fairly inexperienced when it comes to fluid simulations because I don't have $10,000 for a super awesome machine, and I'm a very impatient person. So fluid simulations are just not my style. Nonetheless, I will show you how this basically works. So first of all, let's head over to Blender and create our basic liquid setup. There is, by the way, a little preset that you could do. So we could, for instance, say we start with a cube or any other mesh. We do need to have a mesh, however. Then you can go to Object. Then down here in the quick effects, we can tell it to create a quick liquid. Now this will create the bounding box and all the basic settings. So when we hit the spacebar, we can see how a basic simulation is going on here. Now, I am not too happy with the end result that it gives us, and I also don't like that the bounding box is always expecting things to go down. And in this example, I want to show you how we can work in zero gravity. So you can see there are these quick setups, but we will create our own setup in this scenario. So let me just get rid of this, hit Shift A to create an icosphere and a cube. Let's make the cube larger. Oh, by the way, also make sure to switch over to the viewport shading option here. That is just the outlines, because you know, as soon as we switch it to liquid, this bounding box becomes solid until we do a bake, and that's kind of annoying. So our cube will be our domain. Our icosphere will be the emitter. Actually, I think I will make the icosphere a little bit smaller, something like this. And on the icosphere, then, we will go to our particle settings, or the physics settings, sorry. The particles are up here. The physics settings. We enable fluid, and we choose flow. In this case, our flow should be set to liquid. So the same thing that we did last time. We will also switch our flow behavior over to inflow, because when we set it to geometry, it will only emit particles once, and then they fall. Which can be nice if you just have like a big container of water and you just want water to be emitted once and then settle down. But in this case, I wanted to burst and continue to generate water out of nowhere. So inflow needs to be enabled here. Then in the domain, we will enable fluid as well, and we will change the type to domain and set our domain type to liquid. All right. Then, because Blender kind of like doesn't have very good options when it comes to resetting our settings, the best option is to just go all the way down and change here in the cache to the type from replay to all. Now there are different types of things that we can enable. I will also enable the is resumable option. There are different ways that we can work with this. For instance, the replay makes it so that every time you hit the spacebar, it starts over with the recalculation. But this is only happening if you change settings of the domain. Here, we are not planning on changing too many settings of the domain. The things that we want to play around with are the settings of the emitter. So we would all the time have to go from the emitter, go to the domain, change a random setting back and forth, and then play back again. And that's just annoying. So my recommendation is here to set this to all, because that way, whenever we change something in the domain, we can just, in the emitter, we can just go to the domain, scroll all the way down, and click on the Bake All button again. Because we are just testing things out, I will just set my end to 25 frames. So when I now click the Bake All, and I go back to the beginning, and maybe I will also set my end to 25, and I play this back, I can see what is happening here and what it's baked. So far, so good. Now, obviously, I don't want to have this gravity going on. And there are different places where the gravity can be turned off, but not all of them seem to work properly. So let me show you where I found this to work most reliably. First, let's free our bake. So enable this. Then we scroll all the way down, go to the field weights, and here we can tell it to disable our gravity. When we then bake all again, we can see how nothing is happening because it's just staying in one place. So far, so good. Next, we need to make sure that our emitter emits not from the volume, but from the outside of the mesh, because that way we can enable it to be pushed out. Because right now it's just being generated and then gravity pulls it down, and here nothing is telling it to do anything. So let's go up here to our emitter, and in the settings, under flow source, we will tell it to be is planar, because this will make sure that the planar outside of the mesh is being used as the emitter. And for the initial velocity, let's try to use a normal speed of 50. So we'll take the outside of the mesh, and you might remember a mesh always has an inside and an outside, and this outside always has a direction. So usually it's a perpendicular angle from the planar surface of the polygon. So here, let's try to set this to 50. For some reason, the maximum is, I think, 100. Not quite sure why, because 50 is still not that high, but then again, I haven't played around with it too much yet. In the domain, we then scroll down. Let's just turn this off so we can find the free all button quicker. Let's free all, bake all again. And now we can see how stuff is happening. All right, so apparently this might be a little bit too strong actually with the 50. Although, let's just see what this looks like. Let's enable the mesh and see what this low resolution already looks like with our mesh that we have. So free all and bake all. Because of the mesh that we have, it might take a little bit longer to calculate. There we go. And we can see apparently this looks very low resolution and kind of like blobby. So let's just reset this, go to the free all option and increase our resolution. So maybe we go from 32 to 128. This will already take quite a lot longer to calculate. So let's just do the bake all button. And yeah, we can see that this will take a while. I think I will just pause and continue in a moment when this is done. All right, so this took already a couple of minutes, but when we play this back, we can see how we have this really nice splashy animation, and it is slowly reaching the limits of what my machine can handle. And this is already it's an older iMac, but it's still a pretty good one. So yeah, I don't know how this will behave on your laptops, but you can see how we can create these nice things. Now there are of course a bunch of different settings that you can change in here. But as I said, I'm too impatient to work with fluids. I can't tell you all the differences. There is, however, a really good free 3D course for everything that has to do with fluids in Blender, also containing fire and smoke, and you will be able to create really good stuff after going through it. But it's a very long and intense thing, so I only recommend doing that if you're like, oh yeah, liquids is something I really want to focus on. Then check it out. But otherwise, I'd be like, just be like me and say this. I'm too impatient for fluids. Let other people do that. I will link it up here somewhere. Also, I realized that I cannot link custom links, which is so annoying. I can link to other YouTube videos in this thing up there, but other things are not possible. I need to be a YouTube partner, and for that I need to have a specific amount of subscribers, which I don't, and I don't care. So yeah, I will always link current things in the top and other things, or all of the things, in the description down below. And now I realize why people constantly say you will find the link in the description. I always thought they were too lazy to put them on the video. They just can't. Huh. Anyways, now that we have this, and we switch over to our regular shading here. We could tell this to shade smooth. Now, we should have it selected when we do that. There we go. And we have a nice liquid animation here with these spreading out things. And if you had other objects there, it would of course collide with it. We've already learned how that works in our previous session. Alrighty, the next example that we have in here is a tablecloth. And I'm not quite sure what the specific issue was here, so I will just show you how it works. It's basically exactly the same setup that we did for the ghost, but I will just do it again. Actually, maybe I will need this later on. I feel like I had something where I needed this. So let's call this one liquid. For another example, I just don't remember later on. Anyways. All right, let's start with a new scene and let's create our table first. And for this, I hit S and Z and just scale it down a little bit so it's a little bit flatter. S and X to make it a little bit wider. And maybe I type in 2. So it's exactly a ratio of 1:2. I don't know why I did that. Then I want to apply a bevel, and we know that the bevel is applied before the scale is applied. So the bevel might be weirdly stretched if we apply it right now. So be sure to apply your scale after you scale something. So hit Command A and apply the scale. Then we can go to our modifiers, add modifier, and we can add a bevel modifier. Use something fairly small. Okay, maybe that's too small. 0.3. Increase the subdivision steps a little bit like this, and this I think should work. Then we will create a new mesh and we will use a grid for this. Before we move it around, let's actually switch to our wireframe mode so we can see the resolution, and we can see that this resolution will not be enough for what we need our grid to be later on. So let's open up the options here and increase the subdivision. I also know that it needs to be wider than high later on. So let's give it an X subdivision of 200 and a Y subdivision of 100. We cannot stretch our object in here, but we can stretch it afterwards. So let's select it. Let's switch back to our regular view here, move it slightly above the table. Let's give it a proper width or depth or whatever. And maybe I'll look at this from the bottom so I can adjust the width accordingly. Now, of course, this is not 1:2 anymore. So when I look at my grid, it's not perfectly square, but I think this is good enough. All right, now we can tell our grid, which is the cloth, to have our cloth dynamics. So we will go to the physics and we enable cloth. For the cube, which is our table, we will enable the collision. And that's almost already it. It will look better, as you remember, if our cloth can collide with itself. That's an additional option that we need to set. So on the grid settings, when we scroll all the way down here, oh, there. I was zoomed in too much up and I was like, there are settings missing. The collision, and we enable the self collision here. All right, now when we play this back, this will simulate it and cache this, and it will take quite a while. We could actually also use the cache option here to really make sure that this is saved later on. So when we go back, we can say delete all bakes and then bake all dynamics. But maybe I will do it not for everything, maybe 150 or so. Then we can say bake all, and this will again take a little bit. So I will pause and be back in a second. All right, now that this second is over, I can play this back and I can see how this is falling down and slowly coming to a rest. And 150 is probably not enough to really let it come to a rest, but I think I can pause it at a place where this looks at least close enough. Now, there are usually some slight issues when we have these really sharp corners here where it doesn't work too well, but I think later on when we add our subdivision surface and our thickness, this usually works well enough in the end, even though it's a little bit distorted on the edges. So let's go to our modifiers. Let's first give it a little bit of thickness by adding a solidify, making sure that this goes to the outside so that it doesn't intersect with our floor, with the table. So I set the offset to a positive one. Then we will add another modifier, which will be our subdivision surface. And of course, we will right click and choose Shade Smooth. And now we can see how we have a nice smooth cloth on here. It might look better if we offset it a little bit. One of the issues that we might have with the overlap that we have here, with the weird corner, could be because polygons are overlapping too perfectly. So if we just slightly offset our mesh, we might get a better result. And of course, when our resolution is higher, we might also get a better result, both for the resolution of our collider, so the table, as well as the resolution of our cloth. But the higher the resolution, of course, the longer it will take to calculate. But as you know, I'm a very impatient person, so this is the best that you will get from me. Okay, I think this should be good. Let's go to the next example. All right, so for the next example, the question is, I guess, about how to model a head. And there are basically, let me think, 1, 2, 3, 4 ways of doing that. 2 of them mean that you have money, and 2 other of them mean that you have time and talent. So the end result is it's not easy. So I will also not show you the process myself. I will, however, show you the different options that you have. Option number 1, which is kind of what I would do, of course it depends a little bit on the project and what I need the head for, is using photo scanning. There, I personally love using this application. It's from Agisoft and it's called MetaShape. It's not only used for organic things like scanning heads or shoes or something like this. It's also used for landscaping and architecture and all sorts of things like that. They have a pretty cheap version, or considering how much things it can do and what it offers and the quality that it offers, it is comparably cheap. When we go to the buy options, we can see that the standard edition, which is what you would need, is just around 180 bucks. And that is, for what it does, a really good price. Now let me just briefly show you how it works. Essentially, you've probably known these kinds of things from phone apps. We can take pictures of things and then it's sent to a cloud and then you get a 3D version of the element back. This is pretty much the same thing, but it doesn't only work with pictures from your phone. You can also use pictures from your camera. So the quality of the original pictures will be better. Therefore, the mesh that will be generated can be better. And it's not computed in the cloud, it's computed on your own computer, which might mean that it takes a little bit longer, but you have more options to optimize it, to customize it, and you will always get a much better result. The cloud computing things are always a very quick and dirty thing. They don't take too long, but yeah, the quality is very, very cheap. Like for some quick AR things that you might want, that could be fine, but if you want to have a clean model or a fairly clean model, they're just not gonna cut it. So the process that you are then interested in is called photogrammetry. And there are, or also 3D photo scanning, there are a bunch of tools that are available for Android and iPhone. If you are looking for a cheap version, just Google these terms, 3D photo scanning or photogrammetry, and then you can find a lot of things. Since I've never really used the cheap services or the for free services because the quality was never good enough, there are none that I can recommend. But I can recommend Agisoft. So here, essentially, the process is that you take a bunch of pictures, as you can see here, and then it creates a mesh out of these pictures, and then the texture from the photos that you've taken is projected onto your mesh. and then you have an end result like this. And this works with pretty much anything. So here we can see are just some pictures of a tree, which then gets converted into a mesh, which then gets the texture projected onto it. For architecture it works. This, however, is a very old version from 2014. The quality has been improved a lot, and by now they are also working with the GPU and not just the CPU. So, well, most of you are on Macs, you don't care. But for the Windows people, the scanning processes fairly quickly. However, just to give you an idea, after you've done the scanning, the generating of the mesh usually takes a couple of hours. So when you create the first dense cloud, well, you don't know what that is, doesn't matter. So it's usually 2 steps where a cloud is generated of points in 3D space, and then a mesh is generated, and then the texture is generated. And the creation of the cloud usually takes 2 to 5 hours, and the creation of the mesh can then also take an hour or 2, and the creation of the texture then takes a couple of minutes. So just so that you have a rough idea of what time it takes for these things to happen. But you don't need to sit next to it, you just click some buttons and do a couple of settings and let it run. So here, I think the last example is then finally ahead, where we can see where someone just took a couple of pictures. These are not very good references, so the end result that we have here is fairly bad, but it's still a pretty good end result overall, especially after we put the texture on it. So this is option number 1, unfortunately not for free. Option number 2 is using a plugin for Blender. It's not free, as I said. It is actually very expensive for what it does. But to give you a quick overview, essentially it works like this. You take a bunch of different pictures from the same person. So here, I don't know who that person is, and I also don't care. Then you load them in and you start pinning. So they start with a base mesh of a head, and then you start giving it information. Where is everything on the head? And then you do that on multiple views. And the more views you have, the more it can fine-tune and adjust the shape of the head until you finally have a good basic mesh. Then these pictures are taken and are projected onto the mesh, and then all of these pictures are blended together to get one final texture, which we will see in the end. Here, they're just adding a couple of things with Blender tools like here and stuff, and now you can see how the end result looks like. This, however, also takes a little bit of talent to work with the end result that you have and make it look good. And of course, it does cost money. The version to test it out and to play around with is free, and it's however restricted to 15 days. And when you want to get a license, okay, it's $150 a year. And it's a subscription. So you don't even own the application like you would do with this one. So this one, you buy, you have it, you're good. And I have no idea, I mean, it is a pretty cool application. You get a very clean mesh in the end. Unlike with the 3D photo scanning, your mesh is always a little bit noisy. But still, this is crazy. And lastly, the last option, no, this was option 2. We have 2 more options, too many options for face building. Now you might get the idea of why I don't show one process. The kind of like the original process of building faces before we had any special tools was basically this process where you put in some reference images from the front and from the side, and you start literally building it polygon by polygon. This is very, very time consuming, but this is also one of the most accurate results if you have some practice. So probably the first 2 or 3, 4 times that you do it, the results are kind of like meh, but once you get the hang of it and you get the process of how you like to work with these polygons, you learn the tools of how to extrude them, merge them, create a quick mesh or bridge the polygons like I showed in our last session, how we can bridge between two different rings or lines of polygons. You will get the hang of it, and with this you get the cleanest mesh, the most accurate mesh, and the most control over it later on. But this is very, very time consuming, as you might guess. But the end result, however, do they show the actual end result eventually? Yeah, here we can see it, is pretty good. But as I said, this takes a little bit of time and talent. Something that can be a little bit faster, but takes even more practice and talent, is using sculpting. And here's a video that is pretty cool. I recommend people watch it all the way through. So this is the end result, and he explains the entire process, and he is starting with meta balls. So here you can see that he starts with these meta balls and just creates the very basic shape of the head this way. Then he is converting it into mesh using the Dyn Topo to add more and more details to it. Then, after he has the basic mesh, he actually uses this mesh in order to create a cleaner mesh. Because working with this sort of detailed sculpt is really hard, and you need to have a much cleaner geometry, especially if you want to animate it. So if you don't think about animating it or doing too fancy textures on it, this is usually fine. But if you want to have a very clean mesh, or you need a very clean mesh, then you need to do a retopo. It's kind of like a remeshing, but in a manual way. And this is what he shows here, where he has the basic mesh done, and then he starts building a new mesh on top of it. So essentially the same process that we saw here, but it's not based on a picture, but it's based on already 3D geometry. So you don't need to go back from side view to front view. You can just start creating points on your mesh and have these points snap to the original sculpted mesh that you have. So this is also a very, very popular process of creating a very clean mesh, and it's usually a little bit easier and faster than doing it this way, and it's also a little bit less abstract. Of course, taking into account that you have a little bit of practice in sculpting already. He also talks about a lot of cool things, like he is crazy talented. Here when he starts adding texture to the skin by just using a bump map, it's just so amazing how much detail he puts into all of these elements there. It's really, really cool. So I recommend watching it. He's also commenting parts of it there, which is pretty cool. So I will have it linked down in the description. These are just too many examples. I would just put them in the description below. And these are exactly the 4 ways that you can build a head. The next question is about hands. And we will have a similar example later on. I don't have it right now, but I will just use these ones. I will create hands that are a little bit more abstract, but of course you can always refine the model and add more details. I will right now only talk about the bare basics of it and also rigging it so you can change the fingers. Let's get started. First, let's actually take our cube, and so that we don't mess with the scale, I would say that we just hit tab to switch to the model mode, make sure that, or the edit mode, make sure that everything is selected, so hit A, and then when we scale it, we will actually just scale where the position of points is R. And we are not changing the scale of the object itself. Alright, so here, I would just make it a little bit flatter, so S and Z, and just scale it down here. Then let me zoom in. I think I will let my hand point towards the Y direction, so I hit Command R, add a cut here, hit Escape so it's centered. Then I will go to the settings of the loop cut, and I will create 4 cuts for the 4 main fingers here. Actually, it's 3 cuts for 4 fingers. Then I will take a look at this, and I feel like my fingers are a little bit too high, so I want this to be fairly square. So I hit A to select everything, and hit S and Z, and scale it down until it looks kind of like I have these 4 squares next to one another. When I want to export these out to get my separate fingers, I want to make sure that I'm actually scaling out the individual faces. So I will switch to the polygon mode, then I will select all of the 4 faces that I have over here, and on the left side I click and drag to switch from the extrude region to the extrude individual. And now I can drag out my first kind of like joint. At this point, I want to scale them down so that the fingers separate from one another. I can go up here and make sure that my individual origins are enabled. Then we can hit S and scale them down so that each of them scale down separately. So maybe I'll push this back a little bit more. Oops, that's the Z. What am I doing? G and Y. There we go. So something like this. And then we can use the regular extrude tool, so we could also switch back to our selection mode, and we can just hit E to extrude it out. And then maybe we extrude out one more time, make this one a little bit smaller, and one more time, oops, and that one even smaller. So now we have these basic finger shapes here. We'll then do the same thing for the thumb, kind of, or actually a different thing. We will hit Command R to add a loop cut here. Let's slide it over here. Then again, Command R, create another loop cut, and this is where we'll now extrude out the thumb. For that, I will switch back to my polygon mode, select the face on the side here, switch to my top view so I can see a little bit better how I want it to move. And already when I use my move tool, it's constrained to these 2 axes, the X and the Y axis. The X and the Y axis. Then we hit E to extrude this part out. Then we can move it to where we want it to be and rotate it and rotate it and scale it like so. And then again, extrude it out, rotate, scale, and position it until we feel like, yeah, this could be it, kinda. I think this is good enough for my example here. Then of course we want all of this to be a little bit smoother, so we hit Tab to go back to our regular mode. Then we'll go to the modifiers, add modifier, and we'll use a subdivision surface. So we have our very basic shape of the hand. Oh my god, this thumb looks very sickening. That's fine. Now, I always like to keep backups of my things, so if I want to change the general shape, it might be easier to do it with my rougher polygon version. So I will first duplicate this, Shift D, hit Escape, so it goes back to the original position. Then with the original selected, I hit M, create a new collection. Let's call this one Archive. And then we can hide the archive here. Let's call this one Hand, go to the subdivision modifier, hit Command A to apply, so that we now have this as our actual mesh. Now we want to create a rig, so we start with a bone. To do that, we hit Shift A, then we'll go to Armature, and we just create a single bone. This bone needs to rotate around, so we hit R, X, rotate it around, apparently positive, so 90 degrees. Then I turn on the X-ray mode so I can see stuff a little bit better, and I switch to my top view over here. Then I will move it kind of into place, probably maybe somewhere here. Then I hit Tab to switch into the edit mode of the bone, select the element at the bottom, and I will move it to where the knuckle would be. Then I can hit E to extrude out a new bone, so where the, is this also a knuckle? I don't know. So where that one would be. And one more time for the next one, and one last time for the fingertip. I can always go and select different points and move them around until I feel like that this kind of makes sense. Once I am happy with this, I can start to add some logic to this. So for instance, when these elements are supposed to rotate around, so when we switch from edit mode to the pose mode, for instance, so when this rotates around, I would want the smaller fingertip to also rotate around, because usually they all kind of belong together, at least the first 2 tips there. So what you do is, you need to be in the pose mode for this. You select the tip. No, you select the middle part, then the tip. And then I have no idea. Oh no, it's down here as well. Oh, there it is. There's the constraint. I also only know the shortcut. Let me see if we can do it up here as well without the shortcut. So we add a constraint, and we want the constraint to be copy rotation. I think this worked. It's important to switch the target to local space for both axes. And now when we select the bone over here and we rotate it, it did not work. But that one is the one that got the constraint. Oh, because we didn't choose the target yet. Yeah, if we do it with the shortcut, then the target is already chosen. So here we choose that bone as the... Did it select the right bone? I feel like it didn't select the right bone. Oh, we have to do it ourselves. Yeah, I will show you the way of doing it with a shortcut for the next one. So which bone is this? So here we are currently on bone 3, so we want it to be connected to bone 2. There we go. And then when we take this and we rotate it around, we can see how the other one is rotating as well, which is very convenient. Now for the more automated way, you select the root, so the master, the controller, then you select the tip, that is the one that should be constrained. Then you use, does it work on Mac with Command? Command-Shift-C? There we go. Command-Shift-C or Control-Shift-C on Mac both work, I think. And then we choose copy rotation. Here we can see how it automatically shows the right bone that it should be connected to. The only thing that we do need to adjust here is to set this to local space. And now because this one is connected to that one and this one is connected to that one, when we select our root here and we hit R and constrain it to the x-axis, we can see how this is now bending like a finger. How convenient is that? Then we can take our entire armature structure. So we go over here to the object mode. Then we have our armature. Let's switch to the top view again. Hit Shift D to move it over a little bit. Then we hit Tab to go into the edit mode, not the pose mode. And we can grab our points and adjust their positions like so. So it matches for the next finger. And for the other ones, I didn't make this one shorter, but whatever. We can then probably just copy paste the entire armature. So tap, take this one, Shift D, move it over, and another time Shift D, move it over like this. And one last time for that one. And I think we can get rid of one of the bones. So let's hit tap, select the entire bone, get rid of it. And then we have this one goes to the tip. This one goes here. Yeah, exactly. And this one goes here or something like that. Yeah, sure. Alrighty. Now, let's see if the constraints were moved over. I haven't tested this, but it looks like they did. Nice. So when I take this and I rotate it, that other one is doing it as well. Perfect. Alrighty. Now we just merge all of our armatures together. So we select them, all of them here. Make sure that when you do that, that you are in the, in the object mode, and your cursor needs to be over here. Then you can hit Command J to join them together. And let me again double check if the pose connections are still there. Awesome. All right. Now we can finally bind our rig to our mesh. So we select the armature, no, the other way around. We select the hand, then Command click on the armature. Then we go to Object, Parent, and we choose Armature Deform with Automatic Weights. And now that we've done that, we can select our armature, switch over here to the pose mode, and we can select our bones, rotate around the x-axis, so R and X, and rotate this around and thereby create our own shape of the hand. On top of this, of course, we can also add, let me switch back to my object mode here and turn off the X-ray. On top of this, we can of course also add another subdivision modifier. So this mesh can be as high resoluted as we want it to be pretty much. So when we go in here to our hand, we can add a subdivision surface to our object and tell this to shade smooth. And now we have created a very, very basic kind of like comic-like hand. And yeah, this is pretty much how that works. Now for this next one, I will show you how we could model and texture a leaf like this. I will not talk about the rest because arranging everything can be done with hair, and that's pretty much stuff that we already know. However, generating this texture based on an image is quite the fun technique. So let me show you. First of all, in Blender, we want to enable a plugin or an add-on that is already installed, just not activated. And that, I think we've used this in the past. When you go to add-ons, use the search function, and you want to type in image. And there's this option that is called import-export, import images as planes. Essentially, we can just drag and drop an image from our Finder or Explorer onto the viewport and it will be added as a reference image. Not as a full screen thing connected to the camera, it's literally just a plane with a texture on it. That does not render. So here, make sure that this is enabled. Then we can close this out, get rid of the default cube, and let's take a look at our front, like so. Then we take an image of a leaf and drop it in here. Now for my convenience, I will just rotate it around. So I move it in the center here, rotate it by -90 degrees, and just roughly give it a proper position. Something like this should be fine. Oh, I forgot to click. There we go. Now we can just literally use this as a reference and create our own shape. Let's start by creating another mesh, and that should be a plane, and let's rotate it around by 90 degrees. So we hit R, X, 90. Okay, now let's take a look at our object here, and let's maybe enable the transparency mode or even the wireframe mode, because the empty is not, or the image is imported as an empty. It's not actual geometry, so it will not be affected by our wireframe mode, which is very convenient. This way, we can just see our outlines of the plane without being annoyed. Without being annoyed by the actual mesh here. All right, so let's hit edit, switch to our edge mode, and just start by grabbing edges and scaling them down, maybe moving them around a little bit until it just, whoops, at least roughly matches. Come on, this is the one. We can always hit E to extrude a new edge and adjust that one in the size and the position. I don't need to be too exact here. I'll just do it fairly roughly. So one more here. And I think later on with Photoshop, I will extend it to the top so that it's a little bit cleaner. So I hit E one more time, and maybe I'll clean it up to here. Yeah, that should work. Like so. All right, let's add a couple of more details here. So this one, scale it down. I can always hit Command R and create new cuts. And down here, I'll just freestyle it a little bit. So scale this down, scale it down to somewhere like so, I guess. Then E, yeah, probably a little bit smaller. And then like this. Whoops. What did I do? This should be fine. All right. I think I will also add some cuts. First, I hit Command R to add one loop cut going all the way through the center, like this. And maybe so that my deformations later on work better, I will already add 2 more cuts. So one cut here and one cut here. I could have also just added 3 cuts in there. All right, now to create kind of like a this effect here, I will simply create with the knife tool a cut. So I hit K for the knife tool, I click and let it snap to a point here, hit enter to apply. Maybe actually let me do this down here. Oops. Okay, and then here, and then maybe another cut up here. Okay, there we go. Oh, wrong shortcut. What am I doing? Clink, clink, done, enter, we're good. Oh. Then we can make sure that we are in the edge mode and just delete the edges that we don't want. Hit X, make sure to choose the edges when you delete it, and now we have these cuts there. So far, so good. If we turn off the empty, it should look like this when we turn back to our actual geometry. I think this should work just fine later on. Okay, what next? We want to apply our texture to this, so we will go to our UV editing, switch to the edit mode, make sure that all of our polygons are selected by hitting A, and we can see that something is going on there, but it's not really what we want. Go over here to UV and choose the Smart UV Project option. Just hit OK and leave the settings as default. And now we can see we've created a UV layout based on our object here. We obviously want to match this to our actual texture. So let's click on Open and load in this texture as a reference. So we go to Desktop, choose the image and hit Open, and we can see how this doesn't really match together, but it's fine. Over here, we hit A to select all of our UVs, hit R to rotate it around by -90 degrees, and we realize that apparently this is flipped. That means that I probably didn't rotate things around the right way, but that's okay. We can always flip our UVs by hitting S for the scale, Y to scale it along the Y-axis, and then we just type in -1 and hit enter. And now our UVs are flipped, and I should now be able to adjust it pretty closely to what I had seen before over here. Now when I want to see how this applies to my mesh, I simply switch over to my shading, and in here add a new texture, and I drop in that same image. Connect it to my color, and I can see how now this texture is applied. If I want to optimize this even further, so fill in the gaps here and there, I can just export a reference for Photoshop. For this, I will go to my UV editing, and I will already open up Photoshop in the background. Here, I will make sure that all of my UVs are selected, so hit A. Oops. A. Then you go to UV, and we have the Export UV Layout option. I will just choose my desktop again, and let's call this one Leave UV. Export the layout. Here it shows 2000 by 2000, which should be fine for the size. Then we go to Open, choose the Leave UV, and we can see what this looks like here. So far, so good. Then we can take our leaf that we have here and import it into here. Now, the UV layout that we have will always be 1 by 1, so a square image. So if the reference image that we have is not square, it means when we import it here, we want to stretch it so that it matches to the ratio. But I think here the original image was already square, so this works out quite well. I can then start adjusting this, and I can even use, for instance, the liquify to optimize this. So with my layer selected, I can go to Filter, I can use the liquify, and I can start adjusting this. I will go to, where is it? Where is this overlay option? There, show backdrop. Here we go. And I just want my layer 1, because now, how were the shortcuts again? Yeah, on Mac it's Control Alt, clicking and dragging to adjust the size. So here I can adjust the size a little bit, push this a little bit out so that it goes all the way to the top. Here it didn't match perfectly. Here I guess I want this to be a little bit further down so it matches a little bit better. Here as well. And I think when I go in here, there are a couple of more things that I could adjust. So make it a little bit thicker and push this all the way to the edges that I have. All right, I think this should work out just fine. Let's hit OK and do a before and after. Looks good enough to me. Well, this part here is not perfect, but I can always adjust it later on if I wanted to. Well, undo. So I can now hide my reference. This is now my new image that I work with. I can save this as maybe leave UV PSD, which is fine. I can head over to Blender, go to my shading, and I just replace that image in here. So instead of using the leaf, I can actually use my PSD. So put in the color into the base color, and now I have this nice completely filled leaf, and I have a reference in Photoshop so I can easily add more details to it wherever I want to. Now when it comes to give this a more high poly version of this, let's head over to our layout, enable our textures here, and let's try to add a subdivision surface. So we go to our modifiers and we choose the subdivision surface. As soon as we do this, we can see how everything gets rounded the way that we want it to, but it adds some additional roundings in places where we might not want this. To fix this, we just increase the crease or decrease the crease. Let's head over to our edge tool selection thing and select all the corners and the connecting edges. That should be a little bit sharper. So once selected, we can go over here to N like Nelly to the item, and here we have the mean crease, and this one we will just increase until it gets the sharpness that we want it to have. Down here at the bottom, if we want this to be sharper as well, this will not work. Instead, my recommendation is, because things are overlapping too much, my recommendation is just adding a couple of cuts here. So hit Command R and just create a cut here. You can see how this is making this nice and sharp, and we could also add another cut down here and thereby creating a really nice sharp edge. Alrighty, this seems to work quite well. To add a little bit more detail to the texture, we can add a bump, which I will show in a moment. First, I think I want to add a little bit more roundness and shape to this. So I will go to my modifiers, and on top of this, I will add a simple deform. Now this one twists it in a way. I don't think that this is necessary, although maybe we just do a little bit here, just to give this a little bit of shape. Maybe that's too much. How about 10? 10 degrees. Let's add another simple deform, and this time let's just close these. This time we wanted to do a bend. However, the bend gets kind of messed up as soon as we have another deformation on it, unless we create another object. So let's hit Shift A to add an empty, just a plain axis, and this will be our bend reference. So with a plane selected, we will choose as our origin the empty, and now we can see how this is behaving a lot more the way that we would expect it to. However, it's not bending around the axis that we want to, and when we switch the axis here, it doesn't really do what we expected. So let's keep it on the x-axis and take a look. This right now bends this way. So if we rotate our axis this way, it should bend the way that we want it to. So let's select our empty and hit R and rotate it around the y-axis, the z-axis I mean. So Z, rotate it around. That was not the right axis, was it? It's rotating like this. Oh no, around the y-axis. my initial thing that I said was correct. So R and Y, and we rotate it by 90 degrees. And now I can see how it creates this effect that we wanted. So here we can then define how strongly we want this to wrap around here. All right, I think I will do the first simple deform. Maybe we don't even need it. Maybe just a little bit. I just want a little bit of this imperfection here. Yeah. All right. Now that we have our base shape here, we can add some thickness to this by adding another modifier. And for this one, I would use a solidify, just to add a little bit of thickness here. By default, it will just duplicate our UVs here, so we have a nice clean color for the edges. And let's give this a little bit more thickness. How about 3? Just so that we can see stuff a little bit better. And I think this works just fine. Then we can also bend it along a shape. So let's hit Shift A, create a curve, and let's use a path. I think I will just rotate around the path. Let's hit Tab to go into edit mode. All the points are already selected, so we rotate it around the y-axis by 90 degrees. This looks about right. Then we give it roughly the shape that we are looking for. So let's move to the side with our points here. Let's move one point down here. Maybe one point is over here. Then maybe it goes a little bit down and here a little bit up. Something like this. So we have this little bit of a wavy shape going on. Let's hit Tab to go outside of the edit mode. And now we select the plane, add another modifier, which is our curve modifier. And here we will choose our NURBS path. Now by default, it deforms along the x-axis. Here we set it to Z or negative Z. Negative Z it is. Perfect. And we can now adjust the way or the placement of this by selecting our plane and just moving it up and down. So with G and then Z, we can move it into place. And by rotating around the Z axis, so R and Z, we can choose the way that this should be bent around here. All right. And that should be it. Now by rotating this, however, this is something I should mention. By rotating this, we are changing the relationship between the plane and our empty, so it might make sense to parent them together so that the empty moves and rotates around with our plane. So let's select the empty and Command click on the plane. Then we hit Command P for parenting and we choose Object. Now our empty sits inside of our plane, and when we now rotate it, this should work a lot better. Exactly. Now this rotates the way that we would expect it to. And we can align it with the shape there. Then we can right click on our object and say Shade Smooth. So we have a nicer shading here. And of course the edges should be sharp. So we'll go to our object here, go to the normals and enable Auto Smooth here so that the edges remain sharp. Alrighty. Lastly, to add a little bit of detail to our texture that we have, let's switch over to the shading and literally use the texture that we have as a bump. So let's zoom out a little bit. Let's move this to the side and let's hit Shift A and S to look for the bump. And here we can just use our color. Let's first add a ramp. So Shift A, search ramp. We drop our color into the factor of the ramp, because that way we can adjust the contrast if we wanted to, and we drop this into the height and the normal into the normal of our object. Now obviously this is a little bit too strong, but we can see the potential here. Let's go to the bump and change our distance to 0.01, just so that we have this little bit of a bump going on. And I think this works already pretty well. And we can also use this one in order to adjust the contrast or clip some colors of the image and stylize our bump a little bit. There we go. And now we have modeled this based off an image. Ta-da! Now the next question is how to create these water drippings, and I think we've already talked about fluids, and we know that I'm not the expert there. The additional thing that was asked here is how to kind of like do these ink-like textures. Now combining two different types of fluids is a very, very complex thing. There are some extra applications that are able to mix colors together, like RealFlow for instance, but that costs a lot of money. And is also something that was not used here. In this case, it's literally just a texture that is procedurally generated for our mesh, because our mesh is constantly changing, and that's why we don't have a fixed UV layout that we could work with. So let me show you how to do that. Let's switch over to Blender and open up the water explosion example that we had earlier. Then we will go to our shading and make sure that we already have a material applied. So I've already done it a little bit earlier, so just clicked on the new material button here. Then what we want to do is import an image that we want to use. So I just took something from Unsplash. And if we now pipe the color into the base color here, this will not work because we don't really have UVs, but this is applied to the UVs that we have. In order to apply it in a different way, we will use the texture coordinates as an input for the vector of this texture. So let's hit Shift A and S and search for texture, and we look for the texture coordinate, which we put here. And then we pipe in the generated into the vector. And now you can see how it's applied in a nice way so that we don't really see any edges. It's stretching across our 3D texture. If we want to have more control over this, we just pipe something in between here, and that is a mapping node. With this one, we have the option to change the position of our texture. However, we want to be very careful with that, so we want to move this in a very, very slow way. We can also change the scale of it and the rotation. So here, we can also rotate this around in order to match it better to our texture that or to the model that we have. Then, lastly, we can take the output of this and also use this as a bump map to make this look a little bit more interesting. So when I take my roughness and drag it down to get this really nice glossy texture on it, I will just use the same thing that I have here. Let's just move everything to the side so we have a little bit more room. Let's add a rem just like we did before. Oops. A color ramp. Use the color as the input for the vector, and then we add a bump. Drop the color into the height, drop the normal into the normal, and of course, oops, do this way less. 0.01 probably, and now we can see how we have this really nice texture on here that just adds a little bit more detail to this. Maybe add a little bit of roughness. And even with some roughness, we can still see the bump that we've added. That just adds some nice little additional details to our mesh. And that is pretty much it. The next question, is about this. It was listed as a typography question, and this is a very simple example for the basic people that don't know how to animate yet. I will just roughly rebuild this. When it comes to the material here with the displacement, you already know how to do that. We talked about this in our last session. So let me head over to Blender, create a new file, don't save. And let's actually keep the cube here. Let's add some text. Hit tab to edit it. Lorem ipsum Dorset Amit. Sure. All right. Let me go to my text options. Let's align it to the center. Rotate it around the x-axis. 90 degrees. Move it up a little bit and move it behind my text. So along the y-axis. Like this, or maybe a little bit larger. Sure. All right. Then for this cube, we will add a little bit of a bevel. So we add a modifier, the bevel modifier, and this is already doing exactly what we wanted to. Make sure to tell it to shade smooth. Now, in order to animate this, we simply need to find the property that we want to animate or use the shortcut I. With it selected, we can hit I, and then it asks us what kind of keyframe do we want to enter. And here we just say that we want to enter a keyframe for the rotation. And it then adds a keyframe down here. You can then go forward in time to, for instance, frame 30, hit R twice, rotate it around randomly, hit I again, and insert another keyframe for the rotation. Then we have our first rotation. Then after another 30 seconds, let's just hit R twice again and rotate it to a different place. Hit I, choose rotation, and then we have created this animation like this. If we want to pause it in between here, so by default Blender tries to create a smooth motion between the two rotations, you can head over to the graph editor, and let's make this a little bit larger. Let's click on normalize, make sure that everything is selected, so we hit A and use the period key to zoom in. You can see how here Blender tried to create a smooth transition, and that's something that we might not want. So let me briefly remember where to reset it. I think if we just set it to ease in and out. No, where was it? I've animated just last week and I've already forgotten. Let's try. I mean, it's already that type. We can always adjust it by hand, but I don't want to. I mean, to alter it by hand, you can just hit R and rotate it around and make it so that this is flat. I think I'll just do it like this for now. And now when we play it back, we have this effect of it kind of like pausing here and then going to the next stage, kind of like we have it in this example here as well, where it goes to one place and then to the other. If we then offset these keyframes a little bit, so we could move this over here and this one over here, for instance, then we don't ever really have a point where it stops. So it just constantly does something randomly, a little bit more like in the example that we had. Then when it comes to, I think there's no light or anything. I don't really see anything reflected there. So the texture that is then applied here is literally just the texture that we had last time. I will just do the simple version for now. So with our object selected, let's just, this one already got the default material. That's okay. Let's delete it and hit Shift AS and look for the glass BSDF and pipe it in here. There we go. And for simplicity's sake, I will just switch over to cycles. And now you can see, let's also make our background black. And maybe our text completely white. So here we could add a new material, and let's give this an emission material. No, come on. There we go. So when we now scrub through, we can see how it's distorting the text behind it. Depending on what kind of IOR we set and how far away our camera is, this reflection will behave differently on our text. So for instance, if I go into my camera, let's hit N for Nelly, go to view and lock the camera to view. Let's go over here. If I zoom out or zoom in, we can see how the reflection behaves slightly differently. So I could, for instance, try to zoom out quite a bit, and then I go to the options of my camera. Then I will go to options of the camera here. Then I will go to the focal length and maybe try something like 150 millimeters. And then I can position it where I want it to. So maybe like this. Let's check. So here, 0, 0. This is probably 90, 0, 0. So now everything is nice and perfectly centered. With the Y position, I can then frame this the way I want it to. And when I play this back, I have this nice effect here. The rotation is independent from my scale, so at any point in time, I can just make the scale a little bit larger, and we can see how we have some cool abstract animation here. And if we use our fancy glass material with the RGB offset, then we have the exact effect that we see over here. The last one is how to create something like this, and it's actually fairly simple, and we just use MoCap data and apply the hair the way that we've already learned. There is a tutorial that explains this very well, so I've decided to just link you the tutorial because it's so much easier. So here, this is the end result that you get from the tutorial. Lots of cool techniques that he talks about there, where to get the MoCap data from, how to apply it, how to use the mesh that you then have, and yeah, how to use it all in Blender. So this is actually a very simple thing to do in the end. For the next example, the question is about how to create these low poly mountains and also how to go about kind of like planning larger scenes. I think I will just start with kind of like the mountains and how to create a basic structure, maybe as an example. There is an add-on in Blender that is called Landscape, which gives us a lot of cool options to get a basic mesh of something that looks like a terrain. For this, let's go to the preferences, to the add-ons, and type in Landscape. And here, this is the one that we want to add, Mesh and Landscape. When we enable this, we can get another option up here under Mesh, which is the Landscape. Just like all the other ones here, it's not procedural, so we create it, then we can change some settings, but once we're done, it's finished. If you want to change something up, you need to start over and create another landscape, which especially for this is kind of sad because there are so many options. I wish they would have rather created this like a plugin or something where we can change settings here, but still better than nothing. So here we can see how it creates this basic weird structure kind of like thing. But when we open this up, we can see that there are a lot of settings. Now, I've personally not used it for too much yet, but there are so many good things. So let's start by increasing the resolution here, maybe to 1000. And we can already see how this creates a mesh with a whole lot more detail. Okay, maybe 1000 was a little bit too much. This, yeah, let's try 300. Okay, now that we have this, we can start adjusting our settings here a little bit. For instance, there are different noise types. Can I actually make this larger? I feel like this should be possible, so because things are cut off. Here, for instance, we have a multi-fractal option. We have this almost didn't do anything. Let's try something like marble. Here we go. Now we see that it's a completely different shape to start with. we also have, I don't know, I'm just randomly clicking on things. What is noisy rocks? Oh, this looks nice. This could be something to start with. Yeah, this looks cool. Maybe we'll make it a little bit higher. Was it the depth? No, that's not it. Wait, where was the height? We have our offset. X, Y, here, there's the height. Let's try a height of 1. Now we have lots of things that we could play around with. I mean, this almost reminds me of this one here, where we have kind of like one thing and then we could build a bridge to the other part, you know? Like maybe going from here down there, and then from here going over to here or something. Yeah, that could be something. All right, I think this is a good base mesh to start with. And to just apply it, I just click somewhere else, and then I am done, and I have this to work with. Now, I can of course start using sculpting in order to add more details to this. So for instance, maybe I will keep this one as a copy, so Shift D and Escape, then M, new collection, let's call this one Archive, and disable this. Then we can go to our landscape, and let's try our sculpting, and let's see if we can do something nice with it. Let me switch my MoCap to something a little bit more interesting. Oof, no, that was an accident. Here we go. So where did I say? So here could be some kind of a path. So maybe we could try something like, maybe we could try the layer. Yeah, this is filling things up in a way. Of course, it's a little bit irritated because we don't really have enough details here. So let's try to use a remesh, and let's see what our resolution is. Well, it's already pretty fine, so let's get this even finer. So let's maybe go to 3 and do a remesh. By the way, do not try to create already kilometers worth of mountains if they are not or if they don't have to be together. So here right now, maybe it has to be together. Probably it might have been smart to cut it out. Oh wait, I completely messed up. This is not gonna work. I'm sorry. This is not gonna work because we don't really have a mesh, a volume here. So this will just be very irritated. Yeah, let me force quit this and start over. Sorry. Oh, as I was recreating this, by the way, another little tip, you have the option over here to change the random seed, and by doing that, it is using the same type of noise, but it is creating very different variations. So once you have a noise that feels like it could go into the direction that you want it to, just play around with the noise and see if you might be able to find a different seed that creates something that is even closer to what you were looking for. I will, however, go back to the seed 0, because this one, no, one more, because this one has this really interesting shape that I liked. All right, so let's go back up here to 300 and say that we are good. All right, now we do need to give this a little bit of a depth and volume, so it needs to be a closed shape. To do so, we can switch over to our edit mode here, and we can see it's already a pretty high resolution thing. Then we can double click on our edges here to select them. Didn't want that. There we go. And then we can just extrude it down. So what would be the smartest way of doing that? I hope I'm not breaking anything. Let's switch to the edges, and what if I extrude it now? It's moving down, perfect. So I hit Z to lock it and move it down so I really get a nice big volume here. And then I fill the bottom by hitting F. And then this is closed. The bottom part here is not clean geometry, but that's fine. Later on, once we remesh this, it will be all right in the end. I'm already thinking if it does make sense to do it on the entire mesh. I mean, it's already pretty dense, so my computer might die, but, well, let's see. Okay, so I will start by, again, creating a duplicate and putting this into a collection. Then we go to the landscape and to the sculpting. And let's try to do the remesh already. So we pick our density here. And let's see what happens when we now choose remesh. This worked quite well. Yeah. The issue that I had before was really just because this wasn't a volume, so it didn't really work. So let's maybe try to give this some more. Let's try to go to 3, like I planned earlier. All right, so this is done. I hope that this worked fine. Looking at my mesh, this is very dense. Okay. All right, so let's see. Let's try to do the layer thing, maybe a little bit larger, and see what happens if we draw over here. Okay, so it does not like it there. What if we tried to use one of the flattening ones, like this one? Ooh, no, I think the fill might probably be best here. Yeah, see how we're now creating this really nice pathway here? Perfect. So this is some place where people could work. All right. So then they kind of need to get somewhere down here. So maybe we're trying to flatten this out. So let's try to use the flatten here. Here we probably need some kind of stairs. Let's do a larger flatten here. There we go. Also remember, as soon as we do something somewhere, we can hit the period key, so we'll use that part as the focus area. All right, so let's see, what else could we do in order to maybe use the fill here as well to really get some nice flat area here. So we have then a place after people walk down here. So we could have a bridge from here over to there. And then of course we would need something on the side here. Maybe we could try to add a layer there. Maybe we try it with a layer. Jesus! I guess a little bit. It's just way too strong. Let's do Shift F and decrease the intensity here. This could work. So here, I mean, we don't see at some point anymore what's happening on the sides. Or further down below. Let's smooth it out. Yeah, I might want to do a remesh again, because I got some really weird overlapping geometry that I don't like. But I'll keep it for now and see how my flatten works. If we do it on here, let's try to maybe do a crease first, just to get this here a little bit flatter. So we've created this nice little plateau sort of thing. And then, where do we have this other one, this sharp one? I mean, I could try the draw sharp. Oh, this goes inside. Let's use command to do the opposite. To get a sharper area here. There we go. All right. So now we've created our little other plateau part where we could now get to this element here. All right. So this is obviously just a very quick and dirty and rough way of working with this landscape and trying to kind of like see shapes and using sculpting in order to create adding more details to this. And now, how do we get to this low poly look? So we have this. Let's hit back over to our regular layout and let's use a modifier on here. We'll go to our modifiers, and what we want to use is the one that is called, was it the remesh? No, it's the decimate. That's the one that I was looking for. Now what the decimate does is, when we open this up in this view, it will reduce the amount of polygons that we have. So as I get this, for instance, to 0.5, it needs to think for a little while, and then it will give us half of the polygons that we have right now, which will of course also make our scene behave a lot more responsively. So let's give this a second. It's a lot of polygons that we have here, so it's quite natural that it takes a while. And I think we can go even further down, probably a lot. Let's try something like 0.05 and see what we are getting out of this. I guess I was able to reduce a lot of points on the edges because they were completely flat. So it could reduce a lot of points without us seeing a lot of difference here. But let's see. There we go. Now we're starting to talk. We can see how we still keep our details that we added and this nice edge, and at the same time we get this nice lower resolution version of our mesh. And even though we are able to add more details on the high resolution mesh, we now get this nice low poly edgy look that we see in the references here. And of course we can add an even lower resolution. So here we can go to an even smaller value. Well, I will not do it. Too late. Damn it. We can go to an even lower resolution in order to create this low poly effect. And this also works with other elements. So you could, for instance, start by using these volume blobble things to create separate mountains. I will show you in a second once my Blender is finished doing the same task that it did before. All right, to show you what I mean, let me just create, that's fine. So let me just create another scene. Let's kick this out and let's add a meta ball, and let's just combine a couple of them. So Shift D, Shift D, Shift D, and do, I don't know, this weird, come on, abstract shape here where I have no idea what this is supposed to be, and I don't care. Oh yeah, maybe something like this with a hole in there. That looks funny. All right, so once we have this, we can, oh my god, how was it again? How could we convert this? I think we can just go here and say that we want to convert it to a mesh, right? Yes, perfect. So now that we have this, we can go and tell this to not shade smooth, so we tell it to shade flat. Maybe before we do the polygon reduction, no, let's try, let's see what happens. Let's actually add the decimate thing on there. And let's try something like 0.1. And now you can see how it created this nice, random, edgy polygon thing for us. And this is basically how you create these sort of things. You start by creating, maybe you start with a landscape. You could also start with the landscape and then you can add onto it these sort of things. So you create some basic shapes for these mountains or these rocks yourself, and then you just arrange them on the mountain that you have. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that we are usually just working on laptops, and the more elements we have in our scene and the higher resolution we have and the larger the scene is, the slower our computer will get. So you should start thinking about how you can organize things in collections, because as soon as you turn a collection off, it's basically not there anymore, and it can speed up the performance of your computer. So all the elements that you don't currently need for while you're working, you can just place into collections and turn them off like this. So only the collections that you currently need to work with should be the ones that are active. And that is pretty much how I build scenes if they are a little bit larger. I start with some base. This could be a landscape, or maybe even I create a rough top view drawing where I show like, okay, so I want something here and something there. Then I can load it into Blender, scale it up to a size that is somewhat realistically for that. And so like, you know, remember how we just dragged an image in? So I would do the same thing. And then based on that sketch, I would start building my buildings or mountains and rocks or seas and whatever on there. And even though this was not specifically the style that was in the references, I recently came across a tutorial that is really cool and that shows how to create a really almost like paint-like three-dimensional procedural rock texture in Blender. And it has some really cool techniques in there. So I will add the link in the description down below. And this is the end result that you have. And you can see how it's literally just a very, very low poly mesh that you subdivide. And then a couple of effects and textures are added on top of it to get this end result. And that is super nice and procedural and very fast in the performance, as you can see. So this is not specifically the style that was asked for, but still, I think this is kind of matching and a really, really nice technique that is shown in there. So definitely worth watching. And this concludes part 2, because I'm getting tired of recording so much. And also my screen recorder just decided to not record my screen anymore. So now I need to figure out why. All right, so this was part 2, and there are still more examples. I did not expect this to get so long. But I still hope that you have fun, and I will see you in the next part. Hopefully that is then the last one.